What happens when a person's name is erased from the record, their voice silenced, and their fate decided without a single question being asked? History often remembers the grand sweep of wars and the names of powerful leaders, but it tends to forget the individuals who vanished quietly into the shadows. This is the story of one such man, a man erased without a trial, whose existence was almost completely lost to time. In the early 19th century, many societies were governed by systems that prioritized order above all else, including fairness. Laws existed, of course, but they weren't applied equally to everyone. For those without power, wealth, or social standing, justice was a distant, often unattainable ideal. In this world, a single accusation, or even just a whisper of suspicion, could be enough to erase a life. The man at the center of this story was not famous. He wasn't wealthy or politically important. He lived an ordinary life, known only within his small, tight-knit community. He worked an honest trade, paid what was demanded of him, and dutifully followed the rules that were placed before him. Nothing about his quiet life suggested it would end in such profound silence. The few records that mention him describe a dependable, unassuming person, someone who rarely drew any attention to himself. He was not known for rebellion or public protest. Like so many others of his time, he likely believed that obedience offered a form of protection. That belief, as it turned out, would prove to be tragically, dangerously false. At the time, authorities were granted broad and often vague powers to maintain stability. This power was poorly defined, leaving it wide open to abuse. Suspicion alone could be treated as concrete evidence. Fear, not truth, became the guiding principle behind many official decisions. One evening, without any warning, officials arrived at the man's home. There were no written charges presented. No explanation was offered to his bewildered family or his neighbors. He was simply taken away under the ambiguous justification of protecting public safety. That was the last time his community saw him. On that day, no arrest record was created. No courtroom was prepared to hear his side of the story. No legal representative was assigned to speak on his behalf. The system moved with a chilling speed, completely free from accountability. Sadly, such actions were not unusual for the era. Many governments believed that speed and efficiency were far more important than fairness. Trials were often seen as privileges to be granted, not fundamental rights to be respected. For some, the law was not a shield for the innocent, but a weapon of control for the powerful. The man was transported to a holding facility, a place far removed from his home and everyone he knew. Communication with the outside world was severely restricted, if not entirely blocked. His family, frantic with worry, began searching for answers, but none were offered. Official silence became the only, and most terrifying, response they received. Days bled into weeks, and weeks turned into months. No formal charge was ever recorded against him. His name, once spoken daily in his community, slowly began to disappear from public discussion, without any official documentation of his existence within the system. It became easier and easier to deny he was ever there at all. This absence was not an accident. It was a feature, not a bug, of the system. Systems of power often rely on forgetting just as much as they rely on force. When no record exists, responsibility becomes unclear. And when responsibility is unclear, injustice can survive and even thrive. Inside the facility, the conditions were harsh, but they were also deliberately undocumented. There were no outside observers, no inspections, and absolutely no legal oversight. The people held there existed in a legal black hole, outside the protection of the very laws they were accused of threatening. They were physically present, yet officially, they were invisible. Despite his isolation, the man continued to insist on his innocence. He asked repeatedly for a chance to speak before a judge, to face his accusers, to understand what he had done. Each request was either ignored or dismissed with bureaucratic indifference. Silence was the most common answer he received. Officials justified their actions by citing the need for security and order. They claimed that formal trials only caused unnecessary delays and could stir up public unrest. In their view, efficiency was a higher virtue than truth. Human lives became secondary to the smooth functioning of the procedure. Eventually, even making inquiries about the man became discouraged. Neighbors who asked too many questions were quietly warned to stop. A subtle fear spread through the community. People learned that curiosity could carry consequences. The man's family faced immense social pressure to remain silent. Speaking out risked attracting the kind of official attention they simply could not afford. Their economic survival depended on their compliance. Their grief had to be pushed inward, hidden away from public view, where it festered without resolution. Over time, the man's name stopped appearing in conversations altogether. New concerns and the demands of daily life took precedence. Memory, as it so often does under pressure, began to fade. This fading, this collective forgetting, was an integral part of the system's design. Forgetting reduces resistance. Silence creates the illusion of stability, and that stability, in turn, protects those in power. And yet, despite the system's best efforts, a few faint traces of his story managed to survive. A brief, almost cryptic mention in an old ledger. A letter sent by his family that was never answered. A family record with a name simply crossed out, with no explanation. Historians who later uncovered these fragments described such cases as administrative disappearances. They were legal in practice, even if they were rarely written into formal law. The key was the absence of a trial. Without a trial, there could be no formal finding of wrongdoing that needed to be proven. The system protected itself through its own ambiguity. The man did not die in a dramatic moment that would be remembered by history. There was no public execution, no final defiant speech. His life ended quietly, without witnesses or official acknowledgement. That quiet, undocumented ending was precisely what made the method so effective. For the authorities, the matter was cleanly resolved. No paperwork meant no error. No trial meant no possibility of an appeal. The system simply moved on without consequence. But for those he left behind, the loss was a wound that would never heal. There was no confirmation, no grave to visit, no closure. Grief without answers lingered for generations. This profound uncertainty became a permanent burden passed down through his family. This story, as tragic as it is, represents countless others just like it. It speaks for all the people who were erased not by violence alone, but by procedure, by rules that allowed for removal without explanation, by systems that feared scrutiny more than they valued justice. History books rarely include the names of such individuals. They focus on the big picture, the leaders, the wars, the treaties. But injustice often occurs far from those grand events. It happens quietly, in administrative offices and forgotten holding rooms. The absence of a trial was not an oversight, it was a deliberate choice. Trials create records, and records create accountability. Erasure avoids both. This is why stories like this matter so much. They remind us that what is legal is not always what is just. They show us how systems can function perfectly on the surface, while failing their most basic moral duties, and most importantly, they serve as a powerful warning about the devastating cost of silence and the profound importance of demanding justice for every single voice. Thank you for watching. Imagine a man disappearing, not in a flash of light, but in a rustle of paperwork. One day he's there, a part of the community, a name known by neighbors. The next, He's gone. No trial, no public charge, no jury. Just an absence. His story isn't unique. In that era, across the region, similar removals were happening quietly, not through court orders, but through administrative authority. Governments called it a necessity, a way to maintain order without the slow gears of the judicial system. Public safety became the justification for secrecy, and fear, a convenient substitute for evidence. Official documents were deliberately vague. Instead of clear accusations, they used words like risk or instability, terms that offered no specifics and protected the decision makers. The man's absence sent ripples through his community. Neighbors grew cautious. Conversations became guarded. People learned which questions were dangerous to ask, which topics made officials uncomfortable. Self-censorship wasn't just a choice, it was a survival tactic. Silence wasn't forced with a gun, but it was encouraged by uncertainty. When the rules are invisible, everyone fears crossing a line they can't see. This system depended on compliance, not through constant violence, but through the quiet dread of the unknown. The man's case never made it to an official archive. There was no trial transcript for historians to study, no judgment to analyze. His story survived only in whispers and fragmented memories. Years later, researchers would find these gaps in the documentation names that appeared and then vanished. Files that ended abruptly where accountability should have begun. These weren't accidental omissions, they were intentional. What isn't written down can't be easily challenged. The lack of a legal process allowed authorities to maintain a perfect record. Without a trial, there could be no appeal. Without an appeal, there was no admission of error. The system perfected the art of shielding itself through procedure. For the families left behind, time didn't heal. The uncertainty was a wound that wouldn't close. Hope became a painful, lingering thing. Some continued to petition, writing letters that were never answered, visiting offices that passed the responsibility elsewhere. Their persistence was met with a wall of silence. Others chose to withdraw. They focused on daily survival, burying their memories to protect their future. The man's story shows how power can operate invisibly. No dramatic force was needed to erase him. A series of administrative decisions achieved the same result. Efficiency had replaced justice. Historians now see this not as a flaw in the system, but as a deliberate feature. Bypassing trials reduces scrutiny. Reduced scrutiny allows for repetition, and repetition normalizes injustice. This structure also affected those who enforced it. Officials simply followed orders, never seeing the full picture or the final outcome. Responsibility was so fragmented across departments that no single person felt accountable. This diffusion of responsibility made resistance almost impossible. Each person in the chain believed the critical decisions were being made by someone else. The moral burden was spread so thin it became weightless. The man's erasure reveals a chilling process. A person becomes a case becomes an inconvenience, and an inconvenience is simply removed. This didn't require every person involved to be cruel. It just required them to be indifferent. And indifference thrives in complex, bureaucratic systems where consequences are hidden by layers of paperwork. Decades passed. Slowly, public awareness began to shift. Legal reforms started to re-emphasize due process, framing trials as a fundamental right, not a privilege. But the damage from earlier eras remained. Stories like the man's began to surface, not through official apologies, but through the painstaking work of researchers and historians who pieced together the incomplete narratives. Memory, it turned out, could resist total erasure. The man's life, once nearly forgotten, found new meaning in remembrance. His story wasn't just about him anymore. It became evidence of a systemic failure, a challenge to our assumptions about what is legal versus what is just. It serves as a quiet but powerful reminder that the fight for justice often begins with the fight to remember. Thank you for watching. As societies moved forward, a fundamental question began to surface. Is order without justice truly order at all? People slowly realized that legal protections weren't just technical details. They were vital safeguards against the abuse of power. The absence of a trial in this man's story, the one we're exploring today, became its most important detail. It was more than a procedural failure. It symbolized the total removal of his voice, his dignity, and his very recognition as a person. Without a hearing, truth had no place to stand. Modern legal systems, the ones we often take for granted, emphasize due process as a core principle. This didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was forged in the fire of countless injustices just like this one. Each forgotten individual, each silenced voice, contributed to the hard-earned reforms we have today. The man's story is a stark illustration of why transparency is non-negotiable. When decisions are made in secret, accountability vanishes. And when accountability disappears, power grows unchecked. History has shown us time and again that unchecked power rarely corrects itself. Now, remembering stories like this isn't about casting modern judgment on the past. It's about understanding how systems fail. It's about recognizing dangerous patterns that can repeat themselves, often under new names and different circumstances. History provides warnings, not just records. And if we look closely, we can see those warnings are still relevant. In many parts of the world, people still face detention without explanation. The legal language might have changed, but the fundamental risks remain. Emergency powers and national security laws can sometimes be used to bypass the very scrutiny they're supposed to uphold. The past isn't just a distant memory, it often echoes quietly into our present. This is why historical memory carries a profound responsibility. Forgetting allows harmful practices to creep back in, unnoticed. But remembering creates a powerful resistance through awareness. And awareness is always the first line of defense. The man who was erased without a trial was not unique. He represented thousands, perhaps millions, whose names never made it into our textbooks. Their absence, the silence where their stories should be, shaped our societies just as much as the famous events we all learn about. That silence left marks that statistics and timelines can never fully show. This is where education plays a critical role in preventing history from repeating itself. I'm not talking about the kind of education that simplifies or glorifies the past, but one that explains its complexity and its consequences. An honest history creates informed and vigilant citizens. But telling these stories requires care and restraint. Pain should not be turned into a spectacle. The suffering of others doesn't need to be exaggerated to matter. In fact, respect for the truth is what gives these stories their strength. The true value of this story lies in its stark, quiet reality. There is no dramatic ending to resolve the injustice, and that very lack of resolution is the lesson itself. Some harms can never be undone. For the man's family, the only justice they could find came through memory. Recognition had to replace the answers that never arrived. His existence was affirmed simply by being remembered, and that acknowledgement carried a quiet, undeniable power. Societies often build monuments to honor heroes, carving their names in stone. But those who were erased without a trial rarely receive such recognition. Their legacy isn't found in statues, but in the legal principles and moral awareness that grew from their absence. They help shape what future societies would refuse to accept. The man's life reminds us that rights must be defended consistently, not just for the powerful or the visible, but for the ordinary, the forgotten, and the unheard. Justice loses all meaning when it is applied selectively. Every generation inherits the systems built by the one before it. With that inheritance comes a responsibility to understand the past, because its failures are what must guide our future choices. Ignoring them is an invitation for repetition. The lesson of this story isn't one of despair. It is one of vigilance. Rights and freedoms only survive when people insist on them. Silence allows them to erode. History doesn't demand guilt from the present. It demands our attention. Listening to the forgotten voices is what strengthens our institutions. Awareness becomes our protection. This story also challenges how we think about history itself. Not all truths are found in grand, sweeping narratives. Some of the most important truths arrive through absence, through the gaps in the record. Learning to read those gaps is an essential skill. The man erased without a trial stands as a permanent reminder. A system can appear to function perfectly while failing on a moral level. Legality does not always guarantee justice, and procedure can never replace humanity. By remembering him, we resist the quiet erasure of others. We acknowledge the devastating cost of unchecked authority. We affirm the absolute importance of due process. And most of all, we recognize the enduring power of memory. This story does not ask for your sympathy alone. It asks for your understanding, because understanding is what shapes better systems, and better systems are what protect future lives. If stories like this matter to you, then this channel, Shadows of the Past, exists for that very reason. We are dedicated to remembering the voices that history has tried to erase. By subscribing, you help us keep these stories alive and relevant. By sharing, you help ensure they are not forgotten again. Let us know in the comments which shadow of history you think should be brought into the light next. Every suggestion helps us uncover another forgotten truth. History survives only when people choose to listen. And listening is where change always begins. This was a story from the Shadows of the Past remembered, so it is never repeated. Thank you for watching.